This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The archives.
Episode 371. Does human behaviour render all economic models useless?
Well, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, that was Milton Friedman talking years ago about how we can predict human behaviour because it's basically driven by greed. And of course, economists, even Steve Keen, like to predict what happens based on economic models. Okay, Steve's are more complex than most because we are dealing with a complex system. But isn't the most complicated part of it all human emotions? And that is more than just greed. Are all models based on the idea that we are rational actors, that as Adam Smith hypothesized, that we're all in it for what we can get, basically? But we know that's not true, and some people are very irrational. So does that render economic models, all of them, a bit useless? Does that explain why economists never seem to get things right, and when they do, it's just sheer fluke? That's this week on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, for all the complex modelling that economists do, how much of it is irrelevant because it's based on criteria that suggests that we have rational decision-making? As human beings, we make rational decisions, or we behave the way we have in the past in similar circumstances? And how much of it is to do with confidence or otherwise that we have in the direction of the economy? And how much of it is down to what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits? So, Steve, I mean, did Adam Smith even consider the notion of human behaviour? I think if you went back in time and asked him, he would probably say that he was a behavioural economist. But his thinking was that we acted rationally, of course. And we just don't, do we?
Well, it depends on how you define the word rational. And this is where all hell breaks loose inside economics, because I'll get to this is more a subsidiary point or a subsequent point than an immediate one. But the way that it's defined in economic textbooks now, there are only ever been two rational people on the planet, and one of them we're not sure about. One was Nostradamus, and the other was Jesus. Because they basically say rational means the capacity to accurately predict the future. I am not joking. I wish I was. But that's how they define rational. And not only do they define it that way, they assume we're all that rational. So we have a model in our heads that tells us how the economy is going to behave. If the government does something, we know what impact that's going to have on the economy. And we instantly, in the case of what they call real business cycle models made by people who call themselves new classicals, instantly jump to the unstable equilibrium path towards the point which is known in the original text as the bliss point. Whereas in the case of the what they call new Keynesians, and they have what they call dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models, in that case, we all sort of get there ultimately, but maybe a few of us take a while to get there, so the model adjusts more slowly. But basically, it's all okay because God, Jesus, and Nostradamus are in charge.
Right, but I mean, we do if we all assume one outcome, though. I mean, is that self-prophesizing? So, for example, if we think the economy is going to be great, then we invest and the economy is great.
Yeah, well, there's realistic stuff about what it means to be rational, and there's delusional stuff about how you define rational to avoid all the problems about having to cope with people not knowing the future. So we've got to really divide it up in two ways. And if we go back to Adam Smith, your point about him being a behavioural economist in many ways is quite accurate, because he would talk, he said such things as a businessman never get together except to commit a conspiracy against the public. And landlords, I think either Ricardo or Smith said this one, saying landlords who love to reap where they have never sowed, et cetera, et cetera. So there's extremely strong commentary on people's individual behaviour. But what that comes out of this, and this comes down to Keynes's argument as well, and Keynes is far more rational than the neoclassical nitwits who run economics these days. Individuals are hard to pick, but people move in herds. We're animals and we herd. And when you come down to the animal spirits argument of Keynes, what you get out of that is we have herd behavior. And herds, individual animals in a herd are unpredictable. The herd itself is a damn sight more predictable.
Right, but we're not all one herd, are we? I mean, there's, not every single cow, for example, or horses are herd animals, but they don't all behave the same way at the same time, do they? I mean, they might work together in a herd, but there's, thousands and thousands of herds all operating in different ways. So it's a question of segmentation, really.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point, because there ain't just one animal. Okay,
yeah.
There's a herd of buffalo, and there's also a pack of coyotes, and there's a bunch of snakes, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to look at the ecology and say these are the individual species who are interacting, and their interactions determine the overall environment. That's what you should do, and that's what Keynes did do. That's what Marx did. To some extent, that's what Ricardo and Smith both did. The neoclassical nitwits, and anybody's insulted by that, tough bickies. The neoclassical nitwits we have now assume there's only one herd. There's only one that they talk about, they call the representative agent. And they've gone, I'm sure there's a few neoclassicals now who are spitting in their coffee and saying, what about Hank? And Hank stands for heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models. But in the initial starting point of the way that they model their macroeconomy today is assume there's a single representative agent whose utility preferences can be applied to the entire economy, and who is able to has a model of the economy which will accurately tell him what's going to happen in the future. And if there's a shock, meaning a change to his preferences, so his or the technology, that changes the location of this point in the future, and he instantly jumps to the so that he can leap from millions of miles away and land perfectly on the saddle. I wish I was being facetious. In fact, I'm giving basically so there's nonsense. The least rational people on the planet are economists.
So, as a marketing man of old, particularly the word old, I mean, most of my career was in marketing, and most of that was actually in trying to predict what human behavior was going to be, i.e., are they going to buy our product or not? And, and we did very complex segmentation modeling. So we might say, well, okay, here's a group of people. We can find out, we can see how many people there are in this category because we try and, match demographics to behavior. So we'll say, okay, people of a certain age in a certain household composition in certain parts of town with a certain amount of income and a disposable income of a certain age will behave like this because almost everybody in that category does, so we can start to say, well, who's going to have the strongest brand affinity for us? And that's segmentation. And you can use a lot of, available data to do that. So I don't understand why, given that that's just choosing whether you're going to buy, a packet of cornflakes or subscribe to a particular broadband plan, what's their price sensitivity like? All that sort of good stuff comes from reasonably complex, not, very complex, but reasonably complex modeling based on a number of variables. I don't understand why we can't say, well, okay, let's call them a representative agent. And there are maybe 25 representative agents in the economy who are going to behave in different ways based on this idea of segmenting the whole population and then putting that into your economic models so you see how people, how behavior is transformed.
Look, that's extremely sensible, and that's what you should do, and it's pretty much what I practice. When I'm modelling the economy, I start by having workers who earn wages and will therefore be interested in getting rising wages and worried about the rate of unemployment. Capitalists who invest and want to get higher profit and are going to have to borrowing off bankers to do that and are worried about wages getting too high. Bankers who want to lend as much money as they possibly can, et cetera, et cetera. And when you segment that, you get models that actually look like the real world. That's what we should be doing, and it is possible to do it. But what the neoclassicals have done since 1928 with the original paper by Ramsey, and then since the 1970s with papers by I think Wallace and Sargent and Lucas and Rapping and all the turkeys who've designed modern economics, they want to reach the conclusion that capitalism is the perfect system. And to do it, they're happy. They found themselves being forced to assume that there's a single agent. And then those were the models they were using up to and including the financial crisis of 2007. And even now, when students go to learn what they call economics at universities, they still get taught that as the core model. So they start from a single agent who's the worker that works in the firm that he owns, that pays wages to himself, that gets profit out of it, that doesn't borrow money because there's no banks in the system. And you think, what planet are you on? And actually a question which was asked by a Nobel Prize-winning economist, it's a pretty fairly mainstream, Robert Solow, when he said, you look at if an ordinary person saw the models that mainstream economists would play with, they would actually wonder what planet they were on. And that's the real thing. As I said again, the most irrational people on the planet are mainstream economists.
Yeah, well, certainly don't give them an advertising budget because they'd just throw it all away, wouldn't they? So before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, of course, wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiment, which was, a bit more behavioural, wasn't it? Where he wrote about us being driven by passions, and the passions are basically hunger and sex and fear and anger and trying to avoid pain. So we're all livid if we go for a while without painless sex after a good meal. That seems to be what he's saying. So, and if we understand that motivation, I mean, maybe we can start to predict some human behaviour. Like, for example, if interest rates go up, we know people are going to have less money, so we can predict the response in some quarters from that. So maybe in those circumstances, I mean, particularly if we are living on the breadline, people are going to act more selfishly. Other times, perhaps, they will be less selfish and a bit more benevolent. So, I mean, we can factor in changes in human behaviour. But in an economic model, if we're already saying we need to segment in lots of different ways, and then we have to say, well, people's behaviour is going to change based on, deep psychological, differences between different groups of people based on where the economy is right now. It starts to get hellishly complicated. I'm just wondering whether ever such a model can be built.
Well, it comes down to what's more important, the behaviour of people or the structure of the system in which they are behaving. And when you look at the original start to economics in terms of economic modelling, and that pretty much begins with the neoclassicals under Walras and Jevons in the 1870s, they pretty much assumed you had fairly mechanical behaviour by individuals and a very structured market, and the market would handle whatever nuttiness the individuals throughout it and bring out the best overall social outcome. So that was the initial idea, that the structure of the model mattered more than the behaviour of the individuals inside it. Then you had a whole series of mathematical conundrums that were found by some by economists themselves, others by mathematicians, that found that the end result of the process that Walras and Jevons thought would happen doesn't actually happen. And that's what led to the irrational behaviour by economists, by mainstream economists, because they started making crazy assumptions to evade these logical conundrums with their original mathematical models. And those crazy assumptions ultimately end up with them assuming that everybody on the planet is Jesus or Nostradamus. So that's the wrong way to go about it. But the right way is say, well, the structure matters. And I really couldn't give a brass razoo about what the outcome of the model is. I'm not saying capitalism is better or worse, stable or unstable, anything else. I just want to get a model of it that is descriptive of how it behaves. Then if you do that, you start assuming that people behave in herd-like ways. So when I have, the way that I model the way that workers respond to the level of unemployment and the rate of change of unemployment is fairly mechanical. It seems that like there's one worker agent that will want wage rises if there's a high level of employment. Be worried about that if unemployment's rising at the same time. Take a look at cost of living pressures and try to negotiate those into wage agreements and so on. And that's fairly conventional behaviour. But what actually determines the dynamics of the economy is the structural relationships, the how much, what do workers normally get out of a wage bargain? How much investment is occurring? What is the mechanical, the manufacturing process? How long do they take? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's what the approach taken of what's called system dynamics. And when you do that, you get a model of the economy which is complex, literally, in terms of those complex cycles, but can actually characterize the behavior of the macroeconomy. Whereas if you go the other way and say, well, we've got to get behaviour right, they end up, as I've said, assuming that people can predict the future.
But even on your approach, I'm just wondering whether that level of complexity goes far enough, because you're still at some point you're saying, well, all workers are going to behave the same way. Okay, there's what you're calling the herd mentality. is what's going to win in the end. Give this set of circumstances to people, and they are all going to behave in the same way. There might be a bit of variation, but it's basically saying everybody's behaving the same way. I'm just wondering whether that is the case, and also, even if it was the case, whether there's other factors that are unforeseen. That's always the problem in a complex model, isn't it? What are you missing out? So I'll give you an example on the daily podcast that I do for the bank. There was a person there from the small business division talking about the big problem that small business is facing right now is that they are struggling versus large businesses, because large businesses are passing on cost increases. Small businesses are not. And the reason they're not is because they know their customers intimately. And so they're embarrassed to ask for the pay increase because they know that their customers have been having it tough. It's the whole thing versus selfishness versus altruism, actually. Big business doesn't see the customer, so they're selfish. They say, let's give a big return to our shareholders, which is why they're all recording massive profits. Small businesses, they're struggling because they've got this closer relationship, and so there's a bit more altruism there. I mean, how do you model that sort of stuff? And there'll be millions of examples like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, again, what you pointed out earlier, segmentation, that makes sense. So, I start at the aggregate level. Workers, bankers, and capitalists. And then if I wanted to add in what's going to happen in the real estate sector, I'd add in landlords as another social class, getting their income from rent, owning a property, and so on. And then you have, what is the landlord interested in? It's the rents that are coming in, the price of the housing, and so on. So with a system dynamics model, you can add those segments in there, and you will get fairly dramatic changes to the behavior of the system, sometimes out of adding additional elements to it. So like the most dramatic change in the model that I'm associated with, which is the model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. I took a model by a guy called Richard Goodwin, which had workers and capitalists in it, no bankers. And what that he then had was you get this permanent cycle that looks like, speaking of herds, looks like what's called predator-prey models, where you get if you have let's take an American example, foxes and rabbits. If you have lots of foxes and very few rabbits, then the foxes start to die and the rabbit numbers increase. And after a while, the rabbits are growing very rapidly. So the dying foxes suddenly get a population increase, so they start to rise. And then you get to the point where there are so many foxes, the rabbits decline and bang, bang, bang. You get a permanent, irregular cycle coming out of that. And I added in, what he was assuming when Goodwin made that model, he was assuming that capitalists invest all their profits. And I thought, well, that's unrealistic. They're likely to invest more during a boom and less during a slump. So I added in, and that means, of course, they're going to have to borrow money if they want to invest more than they earn. Then they're going to want to borrow money from a bank. Therefore, they've got to pay interest on that loan. And if the level of rate of profit is very low, and they don't want to invest, then the surplus they use to pay off existing debt. So I put that together, and I got a mathematical model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, which is why I was aware of the probability that there's going to be a financial crisis in 2007. So it comes down to you do have different behavior. You do segment the market in various ways, but the segmentation causes structure in the economy, and largely it's the structure and very simple rules about how people behave that give you the actual dynamics.
But in amongst all of that, you've got government policy as well, just to confuse the whole picture. So, we've talked about this in the past. How much I invest depends on how much I earn and where the tax breaks are. So in the UK, you've got this 60%, tax that you hit, incremental tax that you hit once you hit a certain level of income. And so, not wanting to pay 60%, because psychologically that's rather a lot to pay on top of the 20% that you're paying in VAT. So you put it into a pension, and that's what everyone does because that's tax-free. So a complete, determinant is the behavior of the government. So you've got to throw that into the model as well. And that's how I behave. I mean, there'll be other people who say, no, I need that money. I'm going to take it. So, we're adding yet more dimensions. I mean, I started this conversation. There's so many dimensions to economic modeling, and any one of them could be wrong, but so much of it is driven by behavior, and there's so many individual drivers of behavior. And those segments that I talked about, there could be so many of those that each has their own different behaviors. Are you getting a model that is so complex and each one of those factors could be wrong, which could render it useless.
Your main point is the segmentation gives you your structure, and your structure gives you behavior. And so what you should be doing, and this is what, let's talk about another area of modeling, which is just as complicated, but far more realistic. This is what meteorologists found themselves coping with back in the 50s and 60s, that they were trying to model the weather. Now, the weather doesn't, individual particles of rain don't decide to go and smash you in the face. But the complexity of fluid dynamics is just stunning. So if you're trying to get a mathematical model to predict something as complicated as the fluid dynamics of the entire planet, you've set yourself a very difficult task. Now, what they used to do was pattern matching and linear models, so that have linearly extrapolate change in temperature one day to change in temperature the next. If they'd also look at patterns and say, if there's a particular sequence where there's 6 days of weather that look like the previous 6 days this week, so we're going to predict tomorrow's going to be like the 7th day in that sequence, and all this sort of stuff. And a mathematical meteorologist called Edward Lorenz, said, look, this is just wrong, because we know that the components of the climate interact non-linearly with each other. You can't do linear modeling because that's just not how they interact. And the patterns are going to be, won't necessarily repeat. So he built a model which is called the butterfly model, if you know the idea of the butterfly effect. Okay. And that generated incredibly complex patterns. Now, which nobody expected, including Lorenz, when he first saw it. So he presented this paper. It's a paper called Aperiodic Deterministic Cycles. And when he explained it, the reaction of meteorologists was, yeah, that explains something we haven't got right before. Okay, we'll include that and we'll build our models. Now, what that's meant is, if you go back to weather forecasts in the 50s and 60s, you were better off using a Ouija board. But if you come forward to now, even with the instability of the climate, weather forecasts are reliable for several days to a week out. And that is, and if you saw, like, for example, the warnings about the atmospheric river above California, before that dumped an enormous amount of rain and snow on California, the predictions about the scale of the floods in Greece. This is all being done by meteorologists who've accepted the fact that the weather is a complex system. Now, economists, mainstream economists, neoclassical economists, people who produce DSGE models and RBC models, they're denying that complexity. And that's why they stuff up. Not because human behavior is complex, but economists are too damn simple.
Right. Even though they love their complex formulas, but
they've got to be complicated, but not complex.
Right. Okay, got to be complicated, because that's what stops people like me reading their papers. And so if you've not got that foundation in maths, how the hell can you think about how the system works? So get out.
It's not maths, it's myths. I call what they do mythematics, not mathematics. Because in mathematics, you end up with they want to reach a particular conclusion. This is why they're insane. This is why they're irrational. They want to reach the conclusion, effectively, that capitalism is a self-stabilizing system.
One of our listeners, by the way, somebody, a comment that I think it was on Apple or whatever, said, firstly, they can't listen to this podcast, A, because I'm too left-wing, and I'm thinking, are they listening to what Steve says? But secondly, they say, Steve is so bitter. So let's be nice. When we come back, we're going to be nice to everybody, Steve. We'll take a quick break. I want to look at whether there are some fundamental behaviours that we can assume. So, for example, is the notion of greed right, or are we a little bit more altruistic than that? And then also optimism. How much do we, is that one of the problems, that we are too optimistic? And how is that driven, even in, the simple models that central banks use, for example, the extent to which optimism is factored into all of that. So we'll look at all of that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. Back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So, Steve, if you go back to this idea of, are we altruistic? Do we do stuff which is mutually beneficial, for example? So, the example given by Adam Smith, that the butcher serves you meat not because you look like you need the meat, but because they want you to pay for it and he wants to make money. And, if we go back to tribes people, you might have someone who's making bows and arrows because they're good at that, and others will go and hunt. So they have this mutually beneficial relationship. The hunter gets the tools, the toolmaker gets some food, so it's a win-win. I think this was a point he made in The Wealth of Nations, wasn't it? That this is how economies work together, and that's the idea that it's this symbiotic relationship where we all win. But I mean, that is a sort of a cooperative framework. Is that a safe assumption? Is that a good starting ground for models?
I think it's. It's a very good question, because what we used to have was very small scale human societies, groups of about 150 as a sort of village, 7,000 to 10,000 in a tribe, and convention and custom and reciprocative behaviour was a huge part of how those societies held together. If you had too much oriented behaviour, somebody who's going to try to rip you all off, they're likely to get ostracised, certainly humiliated. So we had a social system that caused a form of collective behaviour that supported the overall group. That was where we came from. Now we have the market system. And, I've jumped over slavery and feudalism in the meantime, obviously. But with the market system, the idea actually came more from de Tocqueville. I've never pronounced the name properly, and the idea of the fable of the bees. And the idea was there that self-interested behaviour leads to the best possible outcome. That's not all how bad bees behave, mind you, but that attitude was that self-interest at the individual level will lead to socially beneficial outcomes at the aggregate level. And that's what you find effectively motivating Smith and Ricardo, that sort of beliefs, to say that the market maximises social welfare. Now, I think the market does what the market does. I don't think it's got any potential outcome of maximising whatsoever. So I just try to model in a more realistic way. But if you believe that attitude, that selfish behaviour leads to an aggregately worthwhile outcome, that's what leads to the modern approach to modelling, which, trying to hang on to this ultimate objective of saying that society maximises welfare, produces perverse assumptions to get there. So I think in overall, if I look at how
which is what Milton Friedman was all about. And I've been watching a few videos from Milton Friedman lately, because he is all about small government, society will produce the best results, and a lot of it will be through selfish behaviour. Yeah. I mean, the bad thing about Milton Friedman, you can see why he was successful, because you look at, if you don't think too much about what he's saying, it sounds quite convincing, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it sounds convincing, because he's basically saying we're going to reach this idealised outcome. But the people who are doing the mathematics behind those models found, no, that's not the case. That's not how the system will work, the way you've described it. You've got to throw something else in on top of it. Now, what they threw up on top was the belief that we're all Nostradamus. What I tried to do in my modelling, and obviously I'm a mathematical modeller, is I start from a set of very simple behaviours where I'm maintaining the structure properly. So workers earn wages, capitalists earn profits, landlords earn rent, bankers earn interest, and therefore you've got those four fundamental factors where they're all trying to maximise their particular way of making a profit. And what I get out of it is a complex system. I don't get equilibrium at all. I get dynamics. I get potential booms and slumps. And if I don't have a government system inside there, then I can get a debt deflation. So the idea is that you need counteracting forces in this system. You can't just leave it to the market. But of course, Milton, which should be the government. Yeah, that's right.
Which should be the government. Yeah. And that is the difference between our altruism and our selfishness. I think we outsource the altruism to governments, don't we?
Yeah, that's a good.
So we think I want to make as much money as I possibly can. I'm happy to pay tax at a fair wage if that is going to help the rest of society, or to invest for growth for which everyone benefits. But I'm going to act selfishly, but my altruism, that's what I vote for governments for. And I'm happy to have that so long as I'm not it's sort of like I'm happy to give to charity so long as everyone else is giving to charity. I don't want to be disadvantaged if I'm the only one who's giving. And there's that sort of attitude, isn't there? Which I think is common. That's a human behaviour.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of putting it, because if I leave the government system out of mind, then what I get is this competitive conflict between workers trying to get higher wages, capitalists after higher profits, and bankers after higher rental interest, is a debt deflation. Capitalists end up borrowing too much money in a boom. the income dynamics of the boom reduce the amount of money they've got to service their debt. They then try to service their debt, but they find they can't, so the debt compounds and you get a breakdown in the system. So that's the three selfish systems. If I add the government inside there, I have the government spending in the opposite direction, increasing its spending if unemployment is rising. That's effectively the altruism side you're talking about there. And when you do that, you get a system which is still cyclical but doesn't have a debt deflation. So you do have to balance. The market itself is not inherently altruistic. In other words, you've got to add something to give it that altruistic side, and that's what the role of government should be. Unfortunately, we have governments managed by people who believe in neoclassical economics, who believe the government shouldn't exist, which is why we have some of the craziness of our modern social system.
Right. So hence, you factor that out, and therefore you've got to have a model which goes, given this set of circumstances, which way are people going to vote? What sort of government are we going to get? And then that becomes even more complicated. That's where does that mean that economic models are a bit useless? Because there's that factor about, how crazy are we going to be when it comes to the polls? Let's go back to another basic then. Something else that Smith wrote about was sort of like, I think he called it overweening conceit. So he said, let me quote, I think this is from his first book, actually. And I'm going to do it in a Scottish. He was Scottish, so I'll do it in a Scottish. I'll do it as George Galloway. That's because it's an easy Scottish.
Oh, yeah, that's correct. I think that's a good accent. Okay, yeah.
The chance of gains by every man more or less overvalued, and the chance of loss is by most men undervalued, and by scarce any man who is in tolerable health and spirits valued more than he is worth. So in other words, everyone thinks that we are going to do better. We are going to produce more than we're actually capable of if we invest. And this is sort of like what Alan Greenspan was talking about in 1996 with the idea of irrational exuberance. If we invest, we expect that investment is going to give us bigger returns than it actually generally does. If you're setting up a business, you think it's going to be more successful than it actually is. Everyone is investing more. We all assume that we're going to get a bigger slice of the market share than we do, or people are going to spend more than they actually do in the end. So this idea of, he calls it overweening conceit. I think irrational exuberance is probably a better way of putting it, which Robert Shiller wrote about in his book of that name as well. We all overestimate, don't we? We over-egg the situation, and that's something that we can put into an economic model and be fairly certain that is a factor.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I do put into my model. So I've got its tendency to invest more if there's a small increase in the rate of profit. And that's what gives you cycles, because, as you say, everybody thinks they're going to get a larger market share than is feasible. So what we have is overinvestment during a boom. And then when the boom falls into a slump, everybody thinking, oh, damn, I want to, conserve as much as I can. So you get underinvestment during the slump. And those booms and bust cycles are an essential part of capitalism. And that's what my sort of modelling does. That's what post-Keynesians in general try to capture, because we're trying to actually describe the behaviour we see in the real world, whereas the neoclassical economists try to pretend the damn thing reaches equilibrium all the time, and they leave out that. So they have people rationally deciding to effectively allocate investment. So the aggregate level of investment is up to 100% of the capacity of the industry. We say it's going to be 130% during a boom and 70% during a slump. And we're realistic, and those guys are off with the damn fairies.
Well, I mean, we do invest more than is available. That's why we have all these other financial instruments like Bitcoin, for example, like crypto. I mean, because at least shares and bonds and commodities, they are all related in some way to an intrinsic value. Bitcoin, there's no intrinsic value. It's all completely emotion.
Well, that's what Keynes called that the activities of a casino, not actual investment. Investment is where you commit something to a physical form. Yeah. So when we talk about that stuff, we call it investment. It's not investing; it's speculating. And the best term I found was actually by the brilliant Austro-Australian economist John Blatt, and he called that placement. Effectively, you're placing your bets. Okay, so that side of thing, in Keynes's attitude to that was, if we leave the determination of the performance of the economy as a side effect of the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done.
But that's what happens, of course. That's where all the money goes. So in models, it's and again, I guess that's in your model. Then you're probably looking at the speed of money that happens as that money sort of in effect goes into those assets and comes out of the real economy. So if you've got a very wealthy group of people putting money into those assets, that money is not working in the real world.
And what you get is you get a distorted industrial structure coming out of it. So, we've got all the money that's invested in the city of London, for example, which an enormous amount of wealth. And, you've got what we call financial engineers. We need real engineers. And what's happened to them? We've denigrated them. We've reduced the extent to which we create them because the money's being made in the financial sector these days. Not so much in the physical economy. So that's the speculation can distort the structure of the economy as well. Again, that's incredibly complicated to bring into a mathematical model, but it's a sort of overlay which gives you financial fragility, which ends up causing the sort of real booms and busts that we see.
I mean, this whole Nostradamus approach, has it got some legs in that you could look at, and I know central bankers like to look at consumer confidence because that helps them understand that the direction that the economy is taking. So do you put up interest rates if there's a lack of confidence? Because you'd think that lack of confidence is going to drive consumption down. So it's a bit of a forward indicator. And if people aren't confident, then you'd expect that they won't spend as much. They will save more because they're worried about the future. So things like that, basics like that, might have some legs, mightn't they?
They might have some legs, but you can't attach those to a neoclassical horse because they want to reach this assumption we all do this stuff rationally and ultimately the market will reach equilibrium. And that's why I'm such a critic of neoclassical modeling and such a fan of system dynamics, because you say what you're trying to describe is the actual system. And if you can't capture its behaviour, then get out of the kitchen fundamentally. So yes, I would like to include those factors in any model that I build, and that was the original birth of system dynamics, to build macroeconomic models that actually generated the real effects we see in the real economy. But for example, your interest rate example, in neoclassical models, I think they call this the Euler equation, which is an insult to a great mathematician. But they argue that people, when they go shopping, look at the rate of interest to determine not just their lifelong consumption, but the consumption of them and their descendants till infinity. And so what they think they're varying by changing the interest rate is actually consumption behaviour rather than investment behaviour, which was the old models they used to do.
Right.
So,
at the same time, they're arguing about the speed of transition. So they're going, we're not seeing the impact of our interest rates yet because people are not seeing it impacting their bank accounts because they haven't had to reevaluate their mortgage just yet. So that's a very immediate outlook rather than any long-term view.
And I think that, it's just, there's an ideological foundation to the modelling, and that's the problem. If you didn't have an ideology that says you want to reach the conclusion that capitalism is a self-equilibrating system which maximises human welfare, if you weren't trying to reach that ending, then you'd say, well, people do have these quirks. They do have these segments to the market, and you would look at all those segments and try to add in sufficient segments to get a reasonably realistic approximation of how the economy behaved in the past, and then hope that can be a guide to how it will behave in the near future. That's what meteorologists have done. That's what economists should do. But what's stopping them in the main is this neoclassical belief in capitalism as a self-equilibrating system.
I do wonder whether actually central banks in particular are starting to throw away some of these neoclassic models. So, for example, if you look at that, so the Conference Board produces what has been seen as being a credible report on consumer confidence. And it right now is basically saying, there's quite a bit of confidence in the economy. So it's got an index value. I'm not quite sure when it's indexed back to, but it doesn't really matter. It's relative. 140. The expectations index, for a year out, I think it is down to 80. So people are saying things are great now, but they're not going to be so good in a year's time. So you'd be looking at that and thinking, well, okay, there's a surefire sign that people are not happy about the future. Better hold off on interest rates. But you watch, they will push interest rates higher because they are basically just looking at the inflation rate. And if the inflation rate's not coming down, they're going to keep on doing what they're doing, whether it overshoots or not. So that's, they are, for all their complex future modelling, they are living very much in the here and now.
Absolutely, and they're leaving out the important stuff, which you've just covered there, very well. So it's not the modelling that's leading us astray. It's this ideology behind the model that tries to reach a conclusion about the nature of capitalism, which is wrong. And if they get, then that's, and the trouble is, that, I must admit, I was quite surprised to see bankers putting up interest rates due to rising inflation, because they thought they'd be more worried about what's going to happen to asset markets, because they've spent the last decade or so lifting up the asset markets after the 2008 crash with things like QE and zero interest rates for that length of time. And now they seem to be doing it without taking any regard to the asset markets. And the only way I can explain that is that they've got back to their textbooks and they think that, they've got a model of how the economy operates that's accurate. And therefore, they put up interest rates, they'll reduce inflation by changing our expectations of, and the value, the rate to which we discount future consumption. And they're back in la-la land again. So it'll take another crash before they wake up, if they ever do.
So just one final point then. Just on my argument, you know what my argument is here. So I haven't heard your definitive answer. Your answer is, yes, we need to be more complicated. But is behaviour so unpredictable, however complex the model, are you ever going to get it right? So let me give you an example of how quirky human behaviour can be. And I can't remember where I read this, but basically it was, if you told a worker that he was going to get £20,000 pay increase, he'd be very excited. So let's say it's tax-free. Congratulations. We're going to give you £20,000. That person would be thinking, great, I'm going to spend that £20,000. I'm going to have a holiday. I'm going to get a car or whatever it is. And they're going to feel very excited about the fact they've got this slug of money coming to them that they didn't have. If you actually, a couple of weeks later, say, sorry about that £20,000. It's only £10,000. They're still £10,000 better off. But as far as they're concerned, they're actually £10,000 worse off. They're very pissed off about it. They'll probably pay down their mortgage a little bit. They will probably save the rest of it. They're not actually going to go out on a spending spree because they are angry about the fact that, as far as they're concerned, even though they've got another £10,000, they've been ripped off. But they've got £10,000. I mean, that's irrational behaviour, but that is human behaviour. How can you ever, just taking that as one example, and there'll be a myriad of others, how can you ever take a series of circumstances and say this is how people are going to behave? Well,
what you've got there is uncertainty about the future. And frankly, I've had an experience very similar to that myself just recently. What it teaches you is you can't just take anything like the £20,000 for granted. You've got to think something's going to go wrong. Something's going to get disturbed in the future. So I can't quite factor all that in. But yeah, that's partly gives you cyclicality. And again, it comes down to the individual copying that. You have a hard time predicting how the individual will behave. The majority copying something like that, you can model the behavior of the herd and say, okay, most of the herd's going to go in this direction. So herd behavior is the savior of modeling real world people, and you segment the herd and you can get into your herd, your pack, et cetera, then you've got a chance to model how the system functions. But you should never expect that you can model it perfectly. And you should also expect that the system itself is a perfect system. And those two latter biases, I think, are why economic modeling is so much worse than any other form of modeling.
So we need a supercomputer somewhere just as we have for the weather system, we need one for the economic system. Which factors in all of these things. But do you think if we did that, is there a chance that we'd get anywhere close to a realistic evaluation of outcomes? But it's not actually just predicting the future, is it? It's actually the real thing we want out of this is what is the public policy that's going to give us the best outcome?
Yeah. I think it's feasible. I wouldn't be doing my systematic modelling if I didn't believe that. So it's feasible to get a model which will say, okay, if you have this policy change, let's feed it into the silicon version of the economy and see what it does. No, that's not what you expected. Let's do something different. And like that comes down very largely to things like the focus on austerity. And I can model that very simply in my Minsky software. And you show that the impact of the austerity is to increase the government's debt level. What? What's going on? The answer is that the reduction in government spending actually causes a slowdown in the turnover circulation of money, and that means that GDP falls by more than the fall in government spending, so you get an increase in the debt ratio. And that sort of guidance is what we need. And even a very simple model that includes the basic fundamentals of money creation will give you those sorts of answers.
Interesting stuff. Look, next week, we were going to do it this week. We haven't been able to line it up, but we also want to read the book before we talk to him. We're hoping to talk to Nick Hanauer, who's got a new book, Corporate Bullshit, Exposing the Lies and Half-Truths That Protect Profit, Power and Wealth in America. That sounds like a rip-rotting success. And we're going to talk about that next week on the podcast, so we'll look forward to that. Good to talk to you, Steve.
Ditto. Thanks, mate.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
Did I just say rip-rotting? Rip-roaring. And you know what I meant to say. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.